So good evening. My name is Ravi Lachhman. I'm a technical director at Sonatype. So a little bit about who Sonatype is. If you ever use Maven, you're welcome. We're the inventors of Maven. I found that out. I used to really rile one of the founders saying I'm a Gradle guy. Like, I love Gradle. He's like, why did I interview you? You just harass me all the time when I come over here. I really riled him. Well, Brian Fox is one of the inventors, so I really rile him up. But I'm really glad to be here. You know, I'm excited to talk. Always been a goal of mine as a young child to come talk at AJUG, and finally I'm able to talk at AJUG. And hopefully you won't riot with me and run away. And so what I want to talk about today is something that's, why is the word supply chain up on the presentation? I mean, newly minted Java developers will find this out, or more seasoned Java pros, as you start looking at, depending how long you've been writing Java for, what happened between the 90s to the mid 2000s to today 2016 is the componentization of software, right? And so I'll leave this next slide up, and then I'm going to have a little chat for people who are in here. So what does it mean to have the componentization of software? We're no longer rewriting the wheel. Companies like Pivotal, my ex-employer Red Hat, large open source contributors really help, from a community standpoint. We're not rewriting a web services framework, we're not rewriting integration engine, we're not rewriting in-memory solutions. We're picking those components from best in breed. But let's all go on a journey today. Let's all pretend, let's say we're all on the same team, right? So we're all on the same project team, and let's say we work for a bank, right? And so we decided that our messaging framework would be JMS based. So day one, we're all sitting in a room, the Scrum's kicked off, we're whiteboarding stuff. What are some considerations for a JMS framework that you would think about? Anybody in the room? So stability is a good one, right? How stable is, how resilient is this framework, right? How feeds and speeds is another one. How, we're a bank. Throughput's important to us, right? So we want to crank out as many transactions as we can. Any other considerations? Maybe recovery, resiliency. These are typical things that we would talk about day one. But what about things we missed, right? So usually when you're looking at building a piece of software up front, you're making a lot of these technical decisions, but what about the non-tangibles? What about the, let's say, non-functional requirements? Licensing, did that ever come up in a conversation? So again, we're on a net new project, we're picking open source components. Do we talk about licensing? At what point, who does? Is it the staff level developer? Is it the team lead? Is it the VP of app dev? Who's talking about licensing? What about project health, right? So are you picking up, and we'll have charts about like, there's marginal returns on investment if a product is getting old. Let's say we picked, I'm going to pick on Spring so much. So let's say we picked RabbitMQ. Wait a minute. let's say we picked Rabbit. Like Rabbit's a good one, right? So like, let's say we pick Rabbit as our JMS framework, right? And there's reasons why I pick Rabbit. It maybe supports MQTT. It like meets our, we can distribute it how we want. But let's look at this other scenario, kind of the darker side of Java development we don't think about is we're all dealing in so many components. We can't be vertical experts on the projects you work on. Unfortunately, you can't be on every project Rabbit's on. Like you're only one guy. We're going to have you 1,000 different enterprises. We can't clone you, unfortunately. So I'm not a vertical expert in Rabbit, but I know JMS, right? So there's certain things that happen that fall by the wayside. You pick these open source choices up front or infrastructure choices up front, and more often than not, we have a saying, I'm going to steal it all the time, it's open source ages like milk, not like wine. So that Rabbit project went on and aged over and over. And, part of using open source, I wear two hats. So I'm app dev and AppSec, right? So anything with app, I do now. So part of the hat is, from a security standpoint, how do we keep track of these components? If I'm working at, let's say we're in a Holiday Inn, so this is an IHG property. I'll pretend I work for IHG. So I apologize if anybody who works for IHG, great company to work for. I know what I've written. My com.ihg items, as a staff level engineer, I know what I wrote, right? There's no question that we know what we wrote. But relying on certain, let's say, open source frameworks like Rabbit, how do we know, we're not experts in that. And using component-based development, the attack vectors are getting wider and wider. That since we have common-based applications, let's say there was an issue with Rabbit. I'll give you a very vertical scenario. This doesn't apply to Rabbit. This happens to another JMS provider. But let's say, again, if this is getting too boring, let me know. Application or platform-based vulnerabilities are coming up more and more because more and more people are using them. It might be something that we don't even think about when we develop it, but it's a corner case that happens 2 years down the line. How do we keep track of it? And so let's talk about some of the numbers now. So kind of moving a step forward, what is this number? No, this is not the number of people who live in Texas, right? 16 million people. But since we are the inventors of Maven, right, Sonatype, so what does Sonatype do? We are the host of Maven Central. So Maven's not Maven Repo 1 and 2. It's us, right? If you downloaded anything, it's like, why is, what am I downloading when I crack open a Java project and all these downloads happen? Well, it's coming from us, right? We're the public repo that represent. 16 million. So this is a continuation on a talk that we did last year. So if it's a little bit redundant, some of the numbers will be interesting. This is an analysis. So we all work in supply chain, if you like it or not. We're dealing with multiple components. If you take a look at a typical Java app, there's hundreds of components now, right? Your palm it's like a book you read sometimes. 16,700,000. This number was analysis we did for a large healthcare provider. I'm being recorded. I can't name names, but they're probably in your wallet in some form or fashion, right? So, and that's a lot of components, right? For a large enterprise, they downloaded something from us 16.7 million times. Even more so, they had almost 20,000 unique gaps, a group artifact version. That means they had 20,000 different parts. And it was downloaded 16 million times. You know who else has this much share? If you go up 85 to BMW, they make X5s there. They also deal with 20,000 different parts, right? So it's hard to for me, it was hard to wrap my head around the IT organization as a manufacturer. I'm a developer, I'm an engineer, I'm not a mechanic. That's something I always preached, right? But if you look at some of the numbers, we have 20,000 unique parts, and we have 16 million of those parts. You're making something big, supply chain, right? So this next slide, nothing that we all don't know in here. Software is redefining the world. This is from Don Duet. Software underpins our businesses, right? And part of the reason why there's been a big shift to open source or even open source components is that, we're such in a competitive environment. We have to make new and new releases all the time. I can't sit here and worry about, an LDAP framework. I can't sit here and worry about, certain paradigms that we just get from the open source community. It's given that we'll get this functionality from somewhere. And how do we stay competitive? We make open source choices. Kind of the same thing. So software is manufactured from parts. Let's take it back to mid 2000s, early 2000s. This little nut-looking thing here would be flipped around. It would be we've written 90% of the code, and maybe from a Java perspective, we have it running, an app server, and we've written 90% of it, and 10% come from app server infrastructure. Fast forward to 2016, this number is actually fairly accurate. We might, from a business standpoint, we've written maybe 20%. So I'll pick on IHG again. So com.ihg.some functionality represents 20% of the distribution size. The other 80% might be from Spring, from Apache, from JBoss, or even a vendor, right? IBM or Oracle. You're buying common infrastructure to run your code. And so what does that mean? For us, it's massive gains of productivity, right? So we're able to focus on what makes the company value. We don't have to worry about infrastructure. We don't have to worry about common libraries. We assume that functionality will be provided. And now this leads me to the state of the software supply chain. Dun dun dun. So we've interviewed. So any questions so far? Anybody disagree? I always like to hear this. Does anybody disagree that we deal with a lot of parts? Right? It's not a unique problem, but it's a unique way of thinking about it. That as you go into your career, maybe some things you did at the Iron Yard might be very small, but if you integrate to a bigger team, let's say you're integrating with people here in the audience, you're going to be exposed to an enterprise project, and the enterprise project will have lots more components than what you're probably looking at. But it's through convention, what to do. I'm not going to touch 95% of the code base because the team lead would yell at me, but I'll focus very narrowly. But if you look at, the expanded, your footprint is really big, right? Why is there 700 megabytes of jars in here? I've written 30 kilobytes, right? These are questions that will be epiphany moments I had when I was a young student. You'll sure have that sometime occur. So, going back to this, we polled 3,000 organizations, and from an application level report, we've sampled 25,000 applications. So this represents the top 10% of our customer base that we intersected. And to show you some of the numbers that we found out, a few concepts. So a few concepts that I'm going to pull the room again. Treating your software like nuts and bolts might not make sense, but people like UPS, people like the manufacturers, they came up with really, really interesting principles. GM, massive manufacturers, they deal with that. They've been dealing with numbers of parts since the Model T. Right? And they have very, very good principles of how to deal with all these parts. So the first one is, these are manufacturing principles. There's a guy, his name is Edward Deming. If you're a history buff, he's the one after the United States, the World War II theater ended in the Pacific. Mr. Demings went over to start helping rebuild Japan and came up with these Toyota Kanban principles. So part of what you see if you go into Scrum and see these little stickers, you can partially blame Deming for that, right? So this guy who's like in the 1960s, you can blame him for why is there post-it notes like a beautiful mind in my Scrum Master's room, right? So part of it is just picking suppliers, right? Like going back to that question, we're all working at a bank, right? We're working at Global Bank or APME Bank, so we'll use a typical name. Who do we pick these open source components from? Why did we go to Spring? Why didn't we go to Red Hat? Or why did we go? I'm picking you right here, so. I don't know. I know. Why didn't they have a Cheetah framework, like cat-based framework? That was my big thing. I used to work at IBM as right out of school, and I used to get in trouble a lot because like I would want to jazz up our product name. So like I worked for Rational, was the brand I worked for, and I remember talking to one of our VPs, like, can we give this like like I used to work for the first rendition of Team Concert Foundation, so like Build Servers and Build Forge. And I was like, can we name it something better than like Rational Team Concert Foundation? Can we name it Cheetah? They're like, no, you're crazy. You should find another job. And I did. So now I have a mortgage. I can't say stuff like that. I have, bills to pay. But when I was out of school, I was like, what are they going to do? Fire me? Yeah, no, they didn't fire me. But I found another organization who was more willing to hear my ideas. So, picking suppliers, right? So part of due diligence, it might not happen at the individual engineer level, but like, why did we pick this vendor? This was as your career progresses, you'll go from junior dev, senior dev, and then you start getting into team lead, architect type positions, and these questions become very valuable. I didn't have to start doing this until like later in my career, right? Like, why did we pick 2 vendors? Is there any sort of efficiency we can gain by picking one? This is a supplier concept, right? People like Toyota will pick only a few limited number of suppliers. Why can't we in the software world do that? Why don't we just roll everything? Now I'll plug you good. Why don't we do everything on a Spring stack, right? So like absolutely, we'll get Spring Boot, we'll get Rabbit, we'll get Spring MVC, everything Spring. It works. Pivotal does a great job. That's one of the reasons to pick a high quality supplier. Like Spring, right? Another one would be warehousing. So to toot my own horn for 2 seconds, we're an artifact. Historically, we've been an artifact repository. So if you hear Sonatype Nexus or your Nexus repository, thank you for having one. It helps pay my bills. So having an artifact repo is only part of our solution can be out for a much more advanced open source management solution. But you store these things somewhere. Like obviously in Toyota, you would store something in a warehouse. It wouldn't be in some guy in Bob's garage, right? Oh, I need to get a new airbag for my Camry. It's actually in Bob's garage. No, they have it in a central warehouse and they ship it out to you, right? Also, kind of third pillar here is, just from a manufacturer standpoint, is understanding we are manufacturers, right? We are manufacturing software. Like it or not, my point of view is we're the manufacturers. When we build the jars, ears, war, SARS, HARS, pick your distribution of choice, we're putting them somewhere where it's a finished good. It's the application that we're making, and then taking those finished goods and having them in a location that we can easily deploy them, and also keeping good track of them. Let's take a look. So again, I did mention this guy named Deming. There are a few supply chain principles you could have. So instead of picking projects from Apache and Spring and JBoss, pick all Spring. Well, picking fewer and lesser suppliers will mean that there's less share. I'm not advocating one or the other, but from a very high level standpoint, having less share in your application stack means less headache for you, right? So the whole concept, one throat to choke. Usually if there's multiple people to choke, you're choking multiple people and it's not fun at that point. Using only the highest quality parts. And what does quality mean in the software world? We have variable measures of quality. From a DevOps perspective, there's this concept of MTR, like mean time to resolution, right? Like how, if we pick an open source component, what does that health look like? Part of the research, again, I'll change every hat. So my application owner hat, previous roles I had, is when we pick an open source component, we look at the vitality of the project. Like, are people actively committing to this project? That's a valid question to ask, right? Because if it's, there's more vitality in a project, there's less chance of, if there is a defect, there's a lower mean time to resolution to get that fixed, as more people are contributing to it. And also, it's something that's extremely hard to do. And I'll tell you, this is that if you read the meetup, some of my misspellings I wrote. If you read what was in the meetup or in the AJUG post, this last one was actually very hard. Continuously track when and where components are used. From a manufacturer standpoint, I'll hate to pick on Takata airbags, but let's say your car was impacted by you had a faulty airbag from Takata, right? Through the magic of supply chain, they were able to hopefully accurately identify who owned these cars and say, hey, you know what, your airbag, if it detonates, it'll be bad for everybody. Please bring it in for a new one. But how do they know where you are? Now, I'm going to put on 2 different hats. I'm going to play app architect, and I'm going to play system engineer right now. So part of this, going back to original conversation, let's say we pick that JMS framework, right? So we picked a particular provider, And 2 years go by, and we find some sort of phantom error. We read on dzone, we're a bank, right? So again, we're a bank. We picked our JMS provider. Half of us changed, or 90% of us changed teams, right? Some people don't even work here anymore. Some people went on. Some people went sabbatical. Who knows where people go, right? But part of being a developer is you're increasing your skill set, so you're changing teams, right? Fair enough to pick up new skills. We read, somebody in the AppSec world reads on dzone, like if we're using this particular .jar, let's say call it Ravi.jar, so I'm the JMS framework. So Ravi.jar is vulnerable because of this reason, let's say some really crazy reason. If you're sending a JMS message and you send a malformed message, the JMS provider will randomly make a virtual topic in queue. Well, that's bad, because why did it make a new topic in queue? Well, I have a limited set of them. And that's how a platform a platform AppSec type of issue comes into play. It's not something someone's done on purpose, but it's how the foggy development, it was something that was thought of to be a good idea that people learn to exploit. It happens all the time. How do we keep track of that? It's like, man, we deployed that application 500 times. It's in, we invented our own region at AWS. Like, where's this app? Where are these components? And that last one is really hard to do. If anybody has been in this production use case, I just want to show of hands. Has anybody ever gotten an email saying, hey, does any one of our, from either a manager or AppSec or InfoSec, is anybody using this Spring component? Is anybody using this component? Has that happened to anybody in here? If anyone said no, I'm like, I want to work for you guys, because it happens to me anywhere I go, I get that error, are you using this? And it's really a pain in the ass, right? Like, imagine from, the amount of time it takes someone to figure that out. There's actually a lot of time. So I'll play AppSec. I read on dzone or Hacker News or, InfoQ, this particular component is vulnerable. Then I scratch my head, because I'm not a developer, saying, let me go blast an email to all the sys engineers, because those guys own, the app servers. They know where the Java's running somewhere, right? So I blast sys engineering, hey, our Acme Bank.war, do you guys use this? And the sys engineers are like, no, I just run Linux boxes all day. What are you talking about? Oh, you mean that thing? Oh, that war? Let me go into my CMDB, config management database, look up, Ravi is the application owner. Let's email that guy. He might know some jars in there. And then they email me, it's like, I haven't touched that app in 2 years. I'm actually on a different project. And finally I'll make up this guy named Frank. We find Frank, ask, hey Frank, are we using this dependency? He's like, yeah, but what's the big deal? I'm like, oh, Frank, we have a little bit of a problem. We have virtual topics and queues popping up everywhere. In fact, we're about to get fined. And how do we, that process took a long time, what I just mentioned there. It's like pulling teeth. It happens over and over and over again. And finally, it's like, why is our config management database not working? And that's part of what having a proper open source governance program, limiting the number of parts so you know what parts you have. So going back to that example, 16 million downloads and 19,800 to almost 20 million gaps or 20,000 gaps. It's a lot of stuff. And it's not to be, if this particular problem doesn't just apply to Acme Bank I talked about. It's happening to all of us, because also a shift in the marketplace, like I mentioned before, and absolutely most people in this room know, is that the supply of open source has never been so massive, right? So we pick your language of choice. I want to show one of these graphs. So I don't know if you can see it in the back. I can send it out to the AJUG Twitter or handle after the meeting. But there's a website called, if you're curious where development languages are going, you can look at their popularity in open source. You can look at, there's a website called modulecounts.com, and this is a graph that they provide. So if you can't read it, it's the top color of this NPM, so Node. This is taking off since 2014. Kind of the tried but true, our invention, Maven, right? So it's chugging along, but it's a number. It's second, but the gap is really widening. So you can see some of the statistics we had. I took one out because it didn't make much sense, but if we take an aggregate over all these open source projects, there's about 1,000 new projects a day. And based on those 1,000 new projects, there's 10,000 versions of stuff a day. So the amount of open source you have, you're just inundated with it. As a developer making development choices, you can pretty much find frameworks for what you want to use, right? So it makes it a lot easier. Tooting our horn for a second, so we have very, very good statistics on Maven Central because, we are the host of Maven Central, right? So chapeau. So this is from a Java from a Java standpoint. I mean, don't worry, Java dropped is secure. We could even prove this from our humble beginnings in 2007 when you thought POM.xml for pomegranate. I used to think that. I was like, what is this POM? Is it for pomegranate? And people laughed at me. But now I know it's not for a pomegranate, right? It's a project or project object. I actually don't know what it means. And I'll get yelled at by the inventor of Maven saying, you work for me. Why do you not know what a POM is? Different story. So hopefully I'm in the same job next year when I come talk to you guys again. So But as you can see here, like from year to year, like 2014, 2015, almost double. We had $17 billion requests, and we got 31 2015. So 2016 surpassed that already, but we're not going to release reports until December 31st, right? So just going back to our spiel again. Now this is where we're going to start going. If anybody saw our spiel last year, I'm going to start comparing some numbers, what we saw, and there's some improvements across it, right? So how do we, principles, how do we keep track of all these components? How do we, knowing that we have so many, it's a new thought space, right? If you go to AppSec, again, half of me is AppSec, so I go to these AppSec conferences, and this is a new problem. Like it hasn't been a problem last 2 years ago, people were like, open source, like, it'll go away. No, it's here, right? Like how do we keep track of it? And so let's look at some of the numbers of the defect ratio. And so part of these two numbers here, 2014 and 2015, are just percent. So we take all the components that are in Maven Central, so we have, X number, 100 to 1,000, and look at what's been downloaded, right? So we have the king of statistics. In 2014, we picked up that 6.2% of components had a known vulnerability. It's like people were downloading it still, they had a known, this is what ends up happening in a project. Your open source choices just stay kind of stagnant, right? So again, pulling the developers into the room, let's say we've been working on a project for like 6 months. How often do you change your POM to include different open source versions? Is it daily? No. You set and forget. Unless you.
I do.
Okay, because you are the open source provider. Like you make the versions, yeah.
Yeah, we make it, but we also, if you're integrating others, you're
pulling latest.
I mean, it's like if you're working on 3 different projects,
sure.
It's pretty frequent.
Absolutely, and it's like, so if you don't know my friend over here, like he worked for Spring Source, right? So they're an open source provider, right? But from let's say 80% cross section of the room here, we're working on an enterprise project that's not from, like we're not a software vendor, right? So like part of yours you'll pull latest every time when you're building new things because your versions will increment as your providers do. But from our standpoint here, if I was on, let's say, I'll pick an IHG again because we're in an IHG building. So if I work for IHG and I was working on some version, I would have a freeze, like saying, look, we need to make functionality. No one touches open source, right? And that's what ends up happening. It's just stagnant. You're not moving versions of Spring MVC every week because we're not the provider. We're just leveraging functionality. And this is true. This is what 80% of people would say, yes, that's exactly what happens. But interesting thing, when we say these numbers, so many people are still downloading the same versions. That 6.2 had a known security vulnerability in 2014. Now more education's been happening like we're doing here, saying, double check what you're doing, go and reinvestigate. What's the word I'm looking for here? Interact with AppSec more. They're not evil people, right? They have good intentions sometimes for us. I'm like, you're holding my release up. I don't care. They have good intentions, right, for the company, but it still is a staggering number. 6.1% of 31 billion components that we served up had a known vulnerability. I mean, that's, close, over 1 billion components that we served up had a known vulnerability. It's slightly down from 2014, but it's still staggering, right? Like, why are people downloading this? Now, we'll take a look at a couple enterprises, and we'll hide names, right? But what might be resonating, saying, our enterprise is like this. So Innovation Wave, again, we're cranking out releases at a yeah, go ahead.
Like when you said you have statistics to download, right? Mm-hmm. Are you going to say that all are being used for enterprise? It could be for some non-enterprise related also, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and your point's fair. So through all downloads. So we're not segregating companies or consumers or individuals, but 6.2 or 2015, 6.1% of components that we shared out from Maven Central had a known security vulnerability. So about 1 billion of them had a vulnerability. And there's some interesting cases. So, thanks for that question or that point. We're under, as engineers, we're under increased pressure to deliver faster and faster, right? Like, again, it's this factory model. We have to release all this mantra about, DevOps and CI/CD and like continuous release and, maybe you want to strangle. I always like to use strangling as a metaphor. Like, I want to strangle my Scrum Master because they cut my sprints down from 3 to 2 weeks. Like, I need vacation sometimes. These are things that all go through our head, right? So why do we work so fast? But it's really, we're producing software in a more efficient pattern. But let's take a look at when we did an analysis over these 3,000 organizations, the average amount of downloads that an organization has, so this is a 10%, like we took a 10% cross section at the top. Average enterprise downloaded about 230,000 components, right? So they're not the 16 million behemoth, but you're ingesting from a Maven standpoint or Maven Central standpoint, 230,000 parts. That's a lot, right? And even more interesting is that second number. Out of those 230,000 parts, The average number of gaps, so again, from a Maven standpoint, group artifact version, it's the coordinate system for a component, 5,200. They had 5,200 versions of something. It could be minor semantic versions, 0.01 releases, but the mere fact that they had 5,200 versions of something, it's interesting, right? Like, how do we deal with this component share? Now, taking this number back here, even more so, they had actually the enterprises that we surveyed that they actually had a higher percent of vulnerabilities, right? For some reason, maybe it's a cross section who we're focusing on, but out of those 230,000 components, about 7.5% had known vulnerabilities, or for some reason, 17,000 downloads in the organization had a security vulnerability. Like, why did it have this? And part of it's a visibility thing. And so we'll talk about this really quickly. So there's certain concepts of where you pick up your open source, and this might be a little bit dry, but there are choices that we make, right? So certain enterprises leverage an artifact repository. So you're not going to Maven Central directly. You're most likely going to a competitor of ours. You could be Artifactory or Apache Archiva, or even if you're lucky enough, come to us, right? We're grateful for that. So if you're using us as an artifact repo, it's part of that principle. Like, if you're storing them somewhere and you have insight into what you're doing, the number of known component vulnerabilities go down inherently because you have someone managing your repo for you, right? And so the first step might be, well, we have Ravi, he's our DevTools admin, he runs the Nexus repo, he found some artifacts in there, let us know. Like, cool, but that helps drive that number down. Also to the right is that these numbers are kind of wonky, that even from a finished good standpoint, why is in a finished good the number of vulnerabilities higher than, let's say, the supply chain? It's just an age thing, right? Again, back to the practice that we typically don't touch the open source, and the mantra that open source changes all the time, right? So it's what's running in production might be technically more vulnerable because we haven't touched the underlying infrastructure due to fear of changing something, right? Which is common. A couple more things I want to bring up on, and this wouldn't be too jarring for anybody. It's just that, again, your software components, they age like milk, not like wine, right? I wish it aged like wine, but unfortunately, it's the older the project, as even some of your open source contributors here, if the project is older, it's probably not getting as much love as it did before when it was, the new hotness, right? And so it falls by the wayside. The number of defect densities go up. Also, as time goes on, again, the big thing is defect density goes up, mean time to resolution goes up. So, it's forced you to think of, well, we used this package 3 or 4 years ago. Does it make sense for us to change? Changing infrastructure is not fun, right? APIs change. It's like pulling teeth sometimes. Like, why did we make this investment? And similar to this, reinforcing this is that older components tend to die off. So what we have here is that, again, as older a component is, the more likely the project is to, it's older something, the project will drop off, right? Kind of common sense. Kind of tying this all together, we're starting to tie it together, and just how severe this is and how staggering this number is. So there's an encryption. I used to have Pokemon here, and I was told that they're trademarked, so I had to take them off my presentations. So I did. I used to have little balls, gotta catch all the vulnerabilities. I was told it's trademarked, so I can't do that anymore. But to this particular point here, just using highest quality parts, there's an encryption library called Bouncy Castle, right? So I used to have don't catch Bouncy Castle, and they're like, no, take the Pokemon off. So Bouncy Castle is an encryption library. So in 2007, the highest score you can get is there's something called a CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System. It's a common AppSec score for vulnerabilities, right? So MITRE puts this out, and the Bouncy Castle library got a 10, right? It's the highest. It's like, why use this? Interestingly enough, when we do our magic reports that we have, because we run the repo, we found that the particular version, or the particular versions with the S of this particular encryption library was downloaded almost 6 million times in 2015. It's like, this 9 years ago, this had a CVSS of 10. Why is it being downloaded? It's just education at this point, right? It's like, we get locked into projects. We don't, it's not unlike my friend here, it's not our vertical specialty to do open source, right? So you can't be in every project. I know, so it's just vertical knowledge, right? We're focused on what makes our company money. I'm not an encryption expert. Why? This is exactly why this happens. And so certain practices are gaining traction, right? So this whole world of, what's in our software. So just curious, does anybody work for a company that sells commercial software? Like we package it and sell it to people? Okay, we have a few people who do that, right? And more so, there's certain principles that are coming out in legislation, so I'll skip over it. So there's legislation that's a coming, right? So we're really keen on this, is having a what we call a software bill of material. It's useful both ways. If you let's say from our friends here who are software vendors, who are selling software, it's when I sell something to a customer, do they have accurate knowledge within the software, or vice versa? I'll pretend that I'm a consumer and I'm buying software from y'all, right? So like you guys made this amazing, let's say, you guys made Uber, right? So you made Expensify, expense software. My Ravi Corporation said, we love your stuff, so let's go ahead and bring it in. We treat that like a black box. Oh, question?
Is this going to apply to software purchased from overseas?
I'm not sure if this has to do with software purchased overseas. This is from the federal government, right? So they have, the word I'm looking for is foreign asset control. So they might say if they're buying software, they want to know exactly where it came from. They want to know lineage of software. Certain organizations are more stringent, like if you look at DoD and Intel, they're like, we want to make sure that no one in China has written this software. So we want to have a good supply chain lineage. But more so, to this example, let's say I bought your software. You guys are on a team, and I purchased your software. More often than not, when I talk to, let's say you guys were a web app I bought, I talk to my assistant engineers like, hey, I just bought this web app from AJUG, AJUG.war. Go deploy this. All you get is a war, right, from a vendor. Like, oh, I need, or an ear, depending how complicated the enterprise deployment is. But you're getting a piece of open source. You're getting a piece of software in a binary distribution. It's a black box. Like, I don't know what open source choices you guys pick. You guys are really smart, absolutely. But I don't know. You might have picked something from some web container from here. You might have picked a piece from here. Who knows? It's a black box. It just runs. Like, oh, I hit Java.jar. Tick, it runs. I get a port. Boom. Application comes up. But these particular problems that we have is how do we know what's in our software? And legislation is coming. Like as you can see, like 3 pillars. Ingredients, bill of materials is important. This is what's represented in our application. This is the recipe for our application. Also, what's really important is hygiene and remediation. Commercial. This might not apply for federal government, but from commercial entities, us by working in a software company, we're kind of tied together by commercially reasonable efforts, right? So these are words I used to use when I used to write software for sale. This is a commercially reasonable effort we went through to remedy something. This kind of legislation could be held against that, saying, well, it wasn't commercially reasonable for you to do this. There's a couple of cases that, I forget who had it. I'm going to draw a blank and ask the audience for help. There was, some of the Oracle defects that they had. They were like commercially liable for it. Like you should have made a better commercially reasonable effort to fix something, right? Under the JDKs that they sell. And also just having remediation, we have to have a patchable way of doing something, right? So if you sell something, there should be a clear path of me to patch or go back and fix what's happening. So any questions so far? We're almost done with my presentation. It kind of went kind of fast, but does it kind of resonate? We're all dealing with so many parts, especially with the open source world. How do we keep track of those parts? Going back to the very first part of the conversation that we had, we were on a team. Typical experience you'll have on a team when you pick open source is you do a lot of the research up front. You do a lot of the diligence. Everyone's really smart. You're not meaning to do anything wrong, but what ends up happening, falling by the wayside, is time just goes on. Time is our friend and enemy. Time moves on. We move on. And how do we, there's open source choice that we have. How do we find where they are? We all change jobs or change teams. Where are they? So from a bill of material type perspective. And also, this again, we're dealing with so much. We can't be vertical experts in everything. We're assuming that certain levels of vetting happened. And most likely, if for our new students here, you might come in mid-level in a project. So let's say I had I was a software dev firm. So I got hired all 4 of you guys. You'll come in the middle of a project, right? So those decisions are already made, but as time goes on, you might be in a position to say, oh, we could change this around. Any questions so far? And I will just show really quickly one of these slides. So we do offer a free tool out there because we just want to help software community at large. Is that we can give you a free bill of materials. We can actually introspect your application choices. This one is for a Java example. We have other language support that we have. So JavaScript, .NET. This is the wrong group to talk about .NET, but we have, .NET, the evil .NET. Yes, no, I didn't. Not on my camera, right? So .NET. I love Satya Nadella. This Microsoft Corporation is amazing. Like, good job, Satya. So, but yeah, we give you a free bill of material. Like if you're curious of what's actually in your software, you can run it one of our online tools. It'll give you kind of perspective. Like you pick these particular open source choices here. I have I use Geronimo Security and Jetty and Catalina, like a little self-contained web app. My Uber jar I have here, and this is what security vulnerabilities, release history, popularity. Just giving you this information up front. We have a few other facts and figures that we have, but I'm going to come really blaze through these because I think we discussed a lot of it before. We also have some calculators that customers came up with that, for a lot of, let's say, if you work on a larger enterprise, these numbers really get staggering from open source management. Like, pick on, if it's just you and I, or two people working on a team, we absolutely know what we're working on, right? Even open source, like, it's in one app, we'll find it, right? But if you're working if you have increasing responsibility, your app portfolio is, dozens of apps now. If your enterprise has thousands of apps, finding these particular needles in a haystack becomes a real problem. That whole email, like, hey, sys engineer, you have that WAR file? Like, yeah, what's in it? That conversation happens hundreds of times. And we have facts and figures like from customers that we pull and that we help, give us, like, they have, their man-hour burden was 20,000 hours a year, like crazy numbers of time it takes people to burden cost to figure this stuff out. And basically by automating it, there's a couple more facts I want to leave you guys with, and then we can partay. So part of how you measure software quality, again, this is one metric. One metric is mean time to resolution, like how long does it take to fix something. Another one is, it's an open source argument. It's number of defects per X number of lines. Here we have X number of defects per 10,000 lines of code. Now, this is kind of industry acceptable standard. Like, okay, we assume when we write commercial software and our ecosystem's totally commercial, we can have 10 defects per 10,000 lines. Like, that's a fair number to say. Now, another journey where we help reduce this number, we worked with a large global insurer. And it's a part of organizational structure also what helps with this. And so again, if we're all on the same team, we definitely know what we write. I mean, we're held to a certain standard. We're employees of this company. It's our best interest to write high quality code. And we do. We're professionals, right? So we're not purposely doing anything wrong. But there's certain things we can't control. We can't control open source quality because we're not the open source provider, right? So we're not the committers on those open source projects, or very rarely that we are. Right, it's kind of an edge case. And so part of what the global insurer was saying that, we produce the highest quality of code. Like, we have all these metrics, we have Kanbans everywhere, our kids have Kanbans stuck in them when they run around. We're very Scrum oriented. But we're still having these defect problems, and they're not coming from us. They're coming from third parties that we use, and we absolutely need these third party libraries because they're crucial to our business. We came in and helped to study with them, also showing them ways that we have products that help identify open source and choices and how to make better choices. They were able to get it down to 4 to 1, from 10, around 10 to 4 by their development practices. They're saying, well, the rest of the defects are coming from open source library coverage. Technically, we got them down to 1. It's an amazing case study that we have. And then, the harder problem again is this particular part of it was keeping current. I'm going to talk about things that are future state stuff that might be coming. So if maybe some people don't straddle some of the sys engineering stuff, but this whole notion of even auto patching open sources being tossed around, like, it doesn't make sense to us to, if you're saying this, I'll pick on Spring again. So Spring MVC 3.1.4 is vulnerable, but 3.1.5 is not. Why don't we just let the infrastructure patch itself at that point? And these are the conversations that are happening. Is it possible to have self-resolving infrastructure like this? So, and that's about it that we have for the software supply chain. I do want to thank you guys. And I didn't want to bore you too much to death, but thank you that you're here to hear us out. And also, as you go back to your day jobs or night jobs, depending what you do, as you're dealing with multiple components, there's just certain things you can do for free. Maybe start a wiki page and listing the components out. Maybe posting the effective POM on one of those wiki pages instead of just the regular POM. Right, so you're having a good bill of material, and it's really starting with that. Even if you post even free things like you use a CMDB, and you said this is our application.org, that POM file is a good recipe for Java language. Maybe posting that in the CMDB, also saying this is our resolution chain and dependency hierarchy. But as you might see me, name is Ravi Lachhman. So I'm at meetups, conferences, user groups, bars. Sometimes you might see me. I wore a different shirt when I go out. So anyhow, I really thank you for your time. Any questions? And absolutely thank you guys for having us here tonight. Any questions from the audience?
What's the name of that tool that you showed?
Oh yes, let me scroll back. So this is Sonatype. It's called the Application Health Check. It's on our website, so sonatype.com, and it's right in the front called Application Health Check. Any other questions? I saw one hand.
One more side.
Oh, whoops. Oh, I'm looking.
Not to the federal government.
Oh, I'm looking at mine. It was like, it's on my screen. Amateur mistake here, so yeah.
Does your tool, or do you have a tool that consists in resolving conflicts. Like one thing I've run into occasionally is one chunk of the project relies on version 1 of some jar, another part relies on version 2, and for some reason, they're not, neither part's able to use the other. They're
not jiving. So our product is not, but I'll give you my I guess my pseudo professional kind of talk about that. That's more of a dev centric task, right? So if there's like using 3.0 on this part of your life, we have an ear, right? And you have 2 wars inside the ear. So one part of your war uses a 3.0 a piece of infrastructure, another piece uses 3.1. There's a lot of inherent challenges with doing that. One, it could be a class loading thing. If I'm going back to my app server days now, right? So it could be there's a lot of challenges if boot structure, right? So did the bootstrap happen? Which version got picked? So from a technical perspective, that's something hard to resolve because it could be more of a conversation of why do we have multiple versions, and go track down the architect and say, you better get a better handle on your people, because why are there 2 versions of something in this? If there's the same, or the flip side of that is, and now I'm going on a little bit of a rant, but since I have your attention, I'm getting power hungry now. So if you have a common library, there's also architectures to say that move that into a common library. Like don't pick one version of it and then say, okay, if it's in 5 of these particular wars, let's move it into a common library and stick it in the app server to be a common library. But our tooling does not handle those kind of collisions, right? It's a hard collision to mitigate, and it's a dev-centric task to go talk through why you made those choices to do that. Sure.
So it seems like in a lot of cases it's a manual job for developers to go in and know what's the latest version, when is the next release going to come out. Do y'all have any tooling around saying, oh, you're using XYZ 1.1 when you know there's a 1.2 now?
That's exactly what we do. Yeah, to nail the point ahead from dev-centric tasks that we like to disseminate. So I'm going to use some architecture, and you might have heard this depending on conferences, but we have a shift left mentality. So we're the left, we're the developers, right? So we'd like to disseminate that information early, because part of the challenge is just the information dissemination. Like I'll go back to our 80% use case. I made open source choices and I stuck with it because I don't want to deal with it, and I have functionality to develop, and it's not my job to develop core infrastructure, right? I'm developing functions. And so that point is, how do I know 1.2 come out? How do I know that a next version of something came out? From when I was actively doing development or even an application owner, I didn't really follow up on that stuff, right? It might be my bad for doing that, but it's a practice that people do. It's not, we don't talk about it too much, but it happens. It gets static. Like one part of the code base is very dynamic. It's, again, the stuff that we're writing, we're developing functionality, but the static stuff is the infrastructure stuff. And your infrastructure in 2016, if you look at the footprint, actually overshadows the amount of code you write. You might be using an integration engine, a web service. You might be using something in memory. You didn't write all that. You got it from a community or a vendor, right? So did that kind of answer your question? And we disseminate the information up front. Anything else we can answer for you guys? Yeah, go for it.
So it's been a while since I've used Maven.
Sure, no worries. Me too. I'll tell the founder, I'm like, no one uses Maven anymore. It's like, he'll feel sad. And
Maven goes to a repository.
Absolutely.
And it could be a local repository for the company.
Yeah.
And somebody manages that.
Someone could.
And they could go and get stuff from you to make sure that it's the latest or whatever they want. Could it not also say, these components you're using have problems, and you ought to consider upgrading them?
And that's absolutely what we do. So, there'll be just 2 parts of that. So part of it is an artifact management question. Like, absolutely don't rely on a public source. Even though we have, really resilient app servers or web servers for Maven Central, you're silly to rely on a public source of information build time, right? So most people bring that information up, cache it in-house. Use an artifact repository. Hopefully use us, buy American. We're, Sonatype. Don't look at the competitors. We're not from here, but I can't say that too much. But Sonatype, it's if you use a Nexus repo, it's synonymous with we're Nexus, right? And you bring those artifacts in-house. So if you have to build something and you have your Maven coordinates, you're pulling that from an artifact repo that it's in your company. So you control the network traffic in there. Similarly, now it's kind of by using our I'll toot the Sonatype horn because we're Sonatype. By using our artifact repository, you're introduced to the platform. So we're more than just the artifact repo. We're an open source management platform that we help score the components that are in the repo, saying, hey, you have these 90 gavs of like 6 different projects. 2 of them are vulnerable. And we do that, we tie that at the repo level, but it's component by component. So you have these little Legos, and we say these particular red and yellow Legos, don't use them. Now, red and yellow Legos make up a little Lego house, right? And so we also have products that look at the application itself, saying, you know, all these components with yellow, red, green, you know, your little house Lego, this is your application. So we can tell you exactly where in the application the problem is and where you deployed it. So it's kind of a continuation model that we have that from a component standpoint, using the repo, we can score components really quickly. What's more centric to, let's say, app owners or sys engineers or app sec professionals is the app itself. We don't care, you know, this particular, I'll pick on Red Hat now. So this particular AMQ.jar is vulnerable, but this AMQ.jar is in our particular, our e-commerce site, .war. Now we care, right? So we are able to provide multiple levels. Depending on the product stack you pick from us, we're providing insights on just those two problems.
And I remember from your last talk here that you actually will provide recommendations about this is what you need to upgrade to.
We do best effort for that. So we absolutely, you know, there's some projects that don't have a path, like Struts 2. Every version from 2.0 to 2.99 is vulnerable from a CVS of 9 to 10. There's no remediation path to it, right? So we'll tell you if there is something that makes sense. We'll say, you know, it makes sense to move to a minor version of this, or even we'll provide you the raw data. Like even more so, we have additional support for JavaScript now. That, you know, it's a lot of times this is the exploit. This is what happens. It's also a conversation, right? Even more so than moving minor versions, we allow you to have a conversation around remedy conversation, saying the example I like to use. Let's say you're using some sort of web service framework, right? I'll pick on again, so Apache, so CXF, right? You're using CXF as your RESTful endpoint, and the new we alerted you to a new vulnerability in your version of CXF. And then so we can do a couple things. We can block that from builds. Like we have very integrated tooling that ties into Hudson, Jenkins, Bamboo. We can block it from builds going forward. You can't deploy because you have we're pulling this analogy together. We're the open source checkmark SonarQube. So and there was another one I always just use, checkmarks, SonarQube. Well, I'll just use those two. So they provide scoring information based on your dev style and your defects or find bugs. Yeah, there it is. Find bugs. We're the open source equivalent of that. Not open source, I mean, we're checking your open source stack. So they focus on custom code that's written, your code. We focus on the code you didn't write. Back to your point, if there is something we can remedy, we'll tell you there's something you can remedy. If it makes sense. But back to the example I was saying, it's a good discussion too, because we'll give you what the known, and we see a lot of customers have, this is a healthy discussion to have, and it's a good one. Say your CXF is vulnerable, right? It allows for SQL injection. It's a web service, absolutely, you can input anything you want, but out of the box, the filters are not configured to look for pipe. I'm making that scenario up. Now, if I was the application owner, let's say you were the the CISO, saying, Ravi, why did you pick CXF 3.0? I'm like, well, because it's for our website. Do you know that it has SQL injection? It doesn't matter because we don't have a database behind the website. Joke's on you, CISO. And that's typically like, it's a remedy type of, we help also usher that remedy in because we'll show you the exploit. And it's like, because the CISO might see, or the AppSec or InfoSec professional, they'll see a score of 9 and they'll wake up early and go to Chick-fil-A and get to work and yell at you like, hey, I got here early today because guess what I saw online? What did you see? I'll use Frank as an example. Frank, what did you see online? That your components have a CVSS of 9. I'm like, okay, what was the vulnerability about? I don't know, but it had a 9. This is a conversation that I'm sure you're going to have eventually. I have rendition to this conversation. And then you can go about, say, Frank, did you read? So let's pull up the Sonotype scan, and we look at the scan saying, okay, it's true we have this component, great. It's true it's a CVS of 9, but also it's for SQL injection, but it's for a website that displays pictures of puppies, and you can't select what puppy you have because we just generate the puppies for you. So joke's on you. It's like, oh, okay. So that's part of the conversation we'll have. Like it's a remedy. Is the attack vector even appropriate for the CVS score? And that's something we can help usher a conversation with too. So thanks for that. Thanks for that question. Any other things, y'all, or?
I'll say something.
Sure.
If anybody's interested in more information about how to get that vulnerability data, I have some booklets here, so if you're interested, I can give you one.
Are there numbers around defects introduced by upgrading to the next jar?
So that's something also very dev-centric task. Because I'll take a very generic stance on that, not using any of our tools, right? So let's say we were going through the exercise as a team, right? So we're moving. There's typically projects hopefully follow something called semantic versioning. So it's major, minor, sub, And and that naming convention will tell you what the capabilities are. If you're moving subversions like 3.1.4 to 3.1.5, that means you're fixing something and your APIs are safe. If you're moving minor versions 3.1.4 to 3.2, that means you're introducing new functionality. And if you're moving from that to 4.0, the APIs change. So that's like one way of telling. Realistically, though, it's my experience as a developer and an app owner that sometimes doesn't work, right? You change versions and all these little red squiggles come up in Eclipse. Like, why? This is my first question. It's like, why are these squiggles here? It makes my life hard now. So we would say from our tooling, I'll bring back us in the picture. So our tooling perspective will give you kind of path perspective, because each application is different, right? You might have jerry-rigged something, you might have patched part of the API that's non-standard. So we'll say in the best case scenario, it makes sense to move to this. And then it's on a dev task to say, okay, we were told to move 2 minor versions up to mitigate the defect. What does that actually take? But at least giving you that information, because playing devil's advocate as a developer or app owner, I wouldn't consider touching that infrastructure ever until something serious happened, like a breach or something, or I got yelled at by Frank the CISO. Like, that will be impetus to change something. But did that make sense? It's a dev-centric task to make sure the functionality is there, or the compatibility is there. But typically, you can be safe to assume minor and subversions are safe to increment. Any other questions from y'all in the room? Cool. Well, thank you guys very much. I appreciate it. So,